So far, we've heard from three different um, opinion from developers on companies, and I think the theme mainly is that there is a cost for development. That cost for development need to be approached from regulatory perspective, when from regulatory agencies that are asking for specific things that could add to it, and then there is a pricing and potential pricing differences. We can discuss these even more, but now we can go to payers' perspective, and we'll start with James Rollins from CMS.
Good morning. My name is Jim Rollins, and I'm the director of the Division of Items and Devices in the Coverage Analysis Group. And I will be speaking from the payer's perspective. If you take a look at Medicare and Medicaid, we serve about 70 million beneficiaries. We're probably the largest insurer in the free world. And whenever we look at a new item or service or device, we have to make sure that the evidence is sufficient to justify the cost of it. So what we need is evidence, and in the past, before Medicare was called CMS, it was called HCFA. And essentially what HCFA did was paid claims. If a new product was developed or if a claim was submitted, it automatically got paid unless edits were put in the system to stop it from happening. And to a certain extent, that still exists at Medicare. If a new product comes in, if it's submitted, it's possible that it could be paid simply through default. And that's the reason why we have to take a look at every new product which comes on the market, because as I said, because of the system of defaults that had been put into place in the past, they would automatically get paid. So we need to make sure that the evidence is sufficient to make sure that it's reasonable and necessary. Now, reasonable and necessary is a term that CMS uses in order to pay for an item and device. And even though the FDA may come out with a new treatment for cancer, what they base their emphasis on is safety and effectiveness. And actually, to a certain extent, it's safety and efficacy, because what they do is they optimize those patients in those clinical trials to get the best results. At CMS, we use reasonable and necessary, and if you were to go to our website and try to find the definition of it, basically what we say is it's a clinically meaningful outcome from the patient's perspective. And actually, it's a clinically meaningful outcome from the population's perspective, not necessarily from the vendors or the researchers who developed it, not necessarily from the physicians who use it, but we place a lot of emphasis from the patient's perspective. Now, if you were to ask the patient about a treatment, what they would say is this treatment going to prolong my life, or is it going to cause some type of harm? So those are the factors that we look at, as well as the improved quality of life that a patient might also experience from that new intervention. In terms of costs, CMS is not, well, here in the coverage analysis group, we're not allowed to take a look at cost. A new product may come on the market which might extend a person's life for 2 to 3 months. It might cost $100,000, and we cannot take that into consideration when looking at that particular technology. Although we can take a look at the indirect costs, such as decreased hospitalization, increased hospitalization, those types of activities we can in terms of cost. The only time that we can really look at cost is if there's a preventive service, and Congress will allow us, CMS, to take a look at costs in terms of that preventive service. And we do work through different organizations to do comparative effectiveness studies, as well as cost effectiveness studies. So those are things that we can look at. But in terms of a new technology and its direct cost, we cannot look at cost. But what we can look at is value. What does this new product bring in terms of value? Now, some people define value as quality divided by resources used. To a certain extent, we look at outcomes as well as the inputs necessary to achieve those outcomes. And cost might be an indirect one of those things that we look at. In terms of oncology endpoints, if you take a look at our national coverage determinations, in the past, we've approved a number of products, and we might look at things such as progression-free survival, time to progression, disease-free survival, or even time to metastasis. And if you take a look at, as I say, our previous NCDs, those are the things that we've used to justify covering a particular product. But CMS is moving more and more away from that to overall survival, because again, that ties back into the patient's perspective of what's considered reasonable and necessary. So, as I said, if you take a look at some of our previous NCDs, there was very little emphasis placed on overall survival, whereas now we're placing more and more emphasis on that. In terms of coverage, in terms of a new product being introduced, basically, if you take a look at the policies from CMS, there's basically 4 options in terms of a decision. Either something was covered and it was paid for, something was not covered and it was not reimbursed for. Sometimes we leave it up to contractor discretion, or something new that we came out with in the last 10 years is something called evidence development. So coverage with evidence development is an opportunity where a new product which has been approved by the FDA, and it might be promising, but the evidence may not be sufficient for the Medicare population. For example, a product might be approved by the FDA, and if you take a look at the persons participating in the clinical trial, they may be persons from the age of 20 to 50, and it may show that it actually works in that population. Can you generalize it to the person 65 and older? No, and we try not to, but it is promising because it does work in that particular age group. So that particular product, we might say we will cover it only if people participate in a clinical trial. So coverage with evidence development is a new tool which CMS has been using recently to cover those new technologies which might be applicable to the Medicare population sometime in the future. So essentially, another tool that CMS has also used recently is something called a memorandum of understanding. That's when a product is currently being evaluated by the FDA, and instead of that product being approved by the FDA and then wanting to get reimbursed by CMS, which can take years, we work collectively in a parallel arrangement with the FDA so that we can review the evidence to determine whether or not it is effective in the Medicaid population. So the vendor or the manufacturer would probably submit information which would fulfill the FDA requirement, and they would also submit information to the CMS to make sure that it's applicable to the Medicare population. So one example of that collaborative relationship between CMS and FDA was Cologuard. Cologuard was approved, I think, last year, and as I said, the manufacturers of the product essentially satisfied all the requirements for the FDA as well as Medicare, and that way the product came to the market much sooner. So essentially, we use an evidence-based medicine approach when we review technologies. As I said, some people say that just because it's approved by the FDA, it should be approved by other payers, and no, that's not the situation. In terms of using an evidence-based medicine approach, we review the medical literature, all the articles that we can find, and essentially use a hierarchy of evidence approach. We prefer studies which are systematic reviews as well as meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials, although sometimes they're not readily available. So we may have to settle on cohort studies. But in terms of hierarchy of evidence, expert opinion as well as anecdotal information is probably at the other extreme. So, as I said, there are ways that new products can be approved through Medicare to try to get them to the public in a faster manner.